minutes off schedule, but we are back on track. Last minute announcement, we just had a Raspberry Pi donated to us for the raffle. So if you're interested in checking out Raspberry Pi, buy a raffle ticket. All right, so we have our next speaker up. He's a little new to BSides Chicago. You may not have seen him around town, but Moey is here with us today. He's going to talk about a subject near and dear to my personal heart, InfoSec's big joke, third-party assessments.
Thank you, BSides Chicago. So I'm going to give a small piece of information first. Is don't ever try to plan a con and submit a talk at the same time. You're going to see how it comes out. So, first things first. How about those SSL bleeds, huh? In all seriousness, I'm going to start off with the standard disclaimer. I'm currently employed, and I would like to stay that way. I'm not here giving a talk on behalf of my employer, the Roman Catholic Church, or any other associations that I belong to. Thank you, and you as well. These are my opinions only, and they're fictional. They're not based on any real events, because real people wouldn't do this, right? Right, exactly. Okay, so who am I? I'm Moey. I'm a hashtag junkie, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. I fight evil by daylight, look for fun by moonlight, and never really run from a real fight. In all seriousness, I've been working in IT for over 14 years, 15 years now actually. 8 of that as a information security generalist, working on everything from doing SOC analyst kind of stuff, issuing certs, tracking down IDS, things along those lines, to working as an information security officer for a major financial institution, where I did a lot of third-party assessments, and I thought I was quasi-reasonable when I did that. And more recently, I've been working at 2 service providers. I won't give any names, but working at 2 service providers. So I've been able to kind of see both sides of the tale of the third-party assessments. But first being first, let's talk about what this talk is. We're going to talk about assessing SaaS providers or service providers, assessing hosting and cloud services, and responding to those evaluations. What we're not going to focus on is product evaluations. Those are a completely different animal. How you evaluate your product for your environment is a completely different topic. I'm not touching on that. I'm not also touching on company viability, meaning, is the investment in that SaaS provider that you're going into sound invested? That's much larger, and that should be part of your organization's procurement process, working with your legal, working with your procurement team to make sure that there's a process in place to make sure you're making financially and vested sound decisions in making that kind of relationship. I'm short on time. I only have 25 minutes up here, so I'm not going to talk about all the different kind of vendor assessment frameworks that I've seen. I have a lot of financial institution experience in my background, so I'm very familiar with BITS. I know the healthcare industry has a different assessment, and I've kind of seen them a little bit of both, as well as some proprietary assessments. That could easily blow this talk out to another 20 minutes. I won't be doing that today just for the lack of time. And last but not least, I'm not going to talk about Kale, FUBAR. Sorry, FUBAR. So why are we doing third-party assessments? It comes down to something like this. Everywhere, and probably in a good majority of organizations, there's some control that reads somewhat like this. Third-party service providers shall demonstrate compliance with information security and confidentiality. That sounds good, right? Third-party reports, records, and services shall undergo audit and review at planned intervals to govern and maintain compliance. So where do you see these kind of where would you see this kind of control? And the answer is just about everywhere. If you're following PCI, you're going to see a control very similar to that, and I mapped it out thanks to the CSA. HIPAA and high tech, you're going to see a control very similar to that for any medical and healthcare. If you're just following best practices, meaning you're ISO compliant or you're using COBIT as your framework, there's controls. So at the end of the day, there's regulations around, hey, we're going to make sure that the people providing services for us are actually secure. That doesn't sound bad, right? I mean, no one's had recent problems with third-party vendors coming into their network, right? That we're aware of? Right. So this is just an academic exercise. So what does the typical process look like? And again, I've sit on both sides of the process here. So the typical process looks something like this. Typically, a vendor is identified. You send out some kind of questionnaire, and this goes back to the comment I made earlier about vendor assessment frameworks and things along those lines, but a questionnaire with tons of questions are sent out to the provider and gone through that way. Next, you conduct some kind of interview, hopefully, to understand the answers that you got back from that service provider and make sure that they answered in a fashion that you expected. There's an optional site visit, so you want to visit their data center and actually make sure that everything they said they're doing, and yeah. You identify some issues, and then boom, mission accomplished, right? Yes, we're done. We could go home. We know we assess our vendor. But that doesn't happen. I've been in situations on both, on the client side where I saw, hey, that service provider who's hosting something for us, our customer service chat window, just got compromised and they're putting up adult images. Well, how come we didn't find that through our vendor assessment process? What did we miss? Go out there. Go take that flight next week. Go out there and see what's happening. And ideally, you don't want to be in that situation after something has happened. But there's a lot of those situations, and I'm going to highlight 4 of them that are known to me, and we'll talk about those. And they're going to be on both sides of the tail. Both sides of the coin. There, that's better. So the first situation, you have a client who asks a service provider to complete a questionnaire because they're changing some services. The service provider completes the questionnaire and returns it along with their SOC 2. SOC 2 covering off on security and everything that's typically covered in security. Through the course of the client performing that assessment, they find out that, hey, they're using a hosted data center. They come back and say, okay, we want your hosted data center to fill out another questionnaire. Is that reasonable? No, it's somewhat shameful. Why was it a little bit shameful? Because there was no contractual clauses in the first-time agreement to actually complete any kind of audit. Hosting provider had no logical access to the data. So they were just providing floor space, and everything was being managed by the service provider. So sending another questionnaire would serve what purpose? Is there any reasonability? And are you actually going back and meeting that control objective? And lastly, it's already covered off in the SOC document that was sent over to them. So, yeah, you have to ask yourself, what was the client trying to achieve there? But it just doesn't happen on the client side. On the service provider side, I've seen stuff like this. Client asks the service provider, explain how confidential data is protected in transit and rest. The stock answer, and this was a stock answer that the service provider had, was opportunistic TLS is configured at the perimeter. As desired, this can be enforced upon client demand. Who could tell me what control this is actually talking to? Email. You got it, Fubar. Email. Shame on you. The service provider didn't answer the question. There was no transparency in the control that was being met. And then the client moves on. The client didn't understand that control at all. Again, what's happening there? Is either side providing the value and meeting the control that's actually legitimate, that's addressing the risk? Next one, going back to the client side. Client got a fancy new application scanner. They're going to scan all the web apps. And they're going to extend that out to the their service providers. So they go out and they scan their service provider. They deliver one particular service provider 3,600 finding report and demand that 130 SQL injection findings be addressed. That seems reasonable to everyone in this room, right? The service provider does what the service provider needs to do, pays their internal security hours, pays internal remediation time so the development team could look at it. And they even go through the extra step of bringing in a consultant to take a look at this for the tune of about $2,000 or so. So why is that shameful? Well, if the service provider had looked, there's no forms or any other user input on that site. The service provider had this great new tool, and they just scanned, didn't do any kind of verification at all. And now on both sides, we're losing time and money on the relationship that could be invested in addressing actual risk. So last but not least, my last example again goes back to the service provider side. After an agreement's in place, about 4 or 5 years, comes time to renew the agreement. Service provider, sitting there, receives an amendment from the client. The new amendment has an embedded questionnaire in it. So they have a process. The process is, every time we have a new agreement, we're going to embed our security questionnaire and send them a list of over 60 controls. So why did this go into the Hall of Shame? Well, it went to the Hall of Shame for a couple of different reasons. The client never conducted any kind of interview. When the service provider came back and asked them questions, say, hey, we didn't have this the last time. We're asking clarification on these security requirements that you have. They redacted them. They're like, oh, no, forget about that. Just sign the cover sheet and send it back to us because you don't have any PII or confidential data. They didn't even understand the relationship that they have with that service provider. So that was just full of failure. You're asking yourself, are you providing a process that works for your business and addressing your risk holistically? No, you're not. It's really become these third-party assessments. It's like calling the help desk. Well, have you tried shutting it off and turning it back on again? Did you answer my question? Did you get the questionnaire? Did you complete it? It's not providing the value and addressing things so that things like we saw last year in December won't happen again. And it's a big fail. It's a big fail on both sides, and it's almost humorous, some of the things that you have seen. Some of the things that I've seen, some of the things that I've heard through friends here at BSides and throughout talking to folks. So it's great that I come out here and identify problems. It's easy as InfoSec professionals to get really ranty and talk about it. But how do we improve? What could we do better on both sides? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. So from a client perspective, meaning if you have to go out and perform these assessments, make sure you introduce a risk rating. Understand that not all vendors that you have are doing the same. You're not going to treat a marketing vendor the same as your cloud provider that you're hosting all your servers and hosting all your external facing websites, right? You don't want to apply the same process. Introduce a risk rating process that actually addresses the actual risk that you are facing with that vendor and assess them appropriately to that. Have ongoing communications with key stakeholders. Now, key stakeholders is an interesting term because I don't mean just report up to your manager, to your CISO. You need to report out. You need to report out to your line of business, to the person that's that relationship manager. You need to report over to that third-party service provider. Work on establishing a relationship and a reasonable relationship. It's not reasonable to go to that service provider and say, I want to understand all changes in your environment. I want to sit on your change management board. That's not reasonable. But you do have to have a process to understand how to communicate clearly to all your stakeholders and how that moves forward. Lastly, understand the framework that you're choosing. I gave one example. Do I look more evil now? Okay. I look like kale. All right. Oh, that's going to be bad. Understand the control objectives. So I gave one example where the service provider answered the question in a fashion that was very particular to email and not answering the question about how data is protected in transit and at rest. Understand the questions that you're asking. And I realize that could be difficult, right? I realize that some of these questionnaires are pretty long. If you're a financial institution and you just download the BITS framework and apply that, some of that language is pretty archaic and may not necessarily make sense. Customize that framework. Don't take it for fact. Understand those questions. Understand what domains they belong to. And I realize that's a little bit out of context because I didn't have a chance to go into the framework portion, but understand those control objectives is ultimately what's key there. On the service provider side, work on transparency of your controls. Be very clear and very honest with your clients to say, these are the controls I'm providing. This is what's happening. If you want anything additional, let's talk about that. This is my standard offering. I have reasonable controls put into place. If you need this plus N, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for the services that we want to provide to you? And what does that mean to you for the cost that we want to charge? Again, have ongoing communications with key stakeholders. On the service provider side, that means that you need to do the same type of reporting. You need to report out to your clients. You need to report in and up. There's always product owners and service providers. There's always a CISO or someone that's responsible for technology that needs to understand these issues. There's not an industry, going back to that regulation slide, there's not an industry that's not starting to look at third parties' assessments much more seriously. So we need to consider that and be able to communicate that clearly. If your client doesn't want a relationship, that's one thing. But you need to at least to try to establish that communication. Remember, your clients could also help improve your information security program. So they could potentially help you identify weak spots or identify areas that management may not take you seriously on until there's a client knocking at your door asking for it. Lastly, make sure you invest in third-party assessments. And by third-party assessments, I don't mean just a pen test, your annual pen test, because that's the least you could do. Bring in somebody and look at what it means to run a SOC, Service Organizations Controls. Take and look what it means to identify an ISO gap assessment and what that actually means as well. And be ready to share and discuss that with your clients. That brings a higher level of assurances to your clients to say, you know, they may not have their ship 100%. Heck, we don't either, right? But they're taking the proper steps to make sure that they're benchmarking themselves appropriately. And that transparency and that investment into your controls and that assessment framework is going to be able to eventually be a business distinguishing factor for your organization. If I was on the opposite side, and I have been on the opposite side, if I look at two providers and one is going through a SOC 1 type 1, and another has no idea, hey, we're not dealing with that data, you don't need to worry about that, which one am I going to lean to as a security professional and talk to my business about? Say, yeah, that first vendor, the one that's investing in a SOC, that's the one I want to go with because they have a better idea of what's going on. They're more concerned about security than that other vendor that has no idea of what's going on. So we talked about what the typical process looks like. Vendor identified, questionnaire, interview, site, issues, mission accomplished. Yay. That's not working on the client side. That's not working. What the process needs to look like is something like this. Again, you're always going to have a process to identify vendors. You need to, again, risk rate that vendor. Understand what type of data, what type of services that vendor is providing for you. Send out your questionnaire. Follow a framework. There's nothing wrong with frameworks. And again, I really wish I had more time to talk about the frameworks and how to apply them appropriately. There's nothing really wrong with sending out the questionnaire as long as you understand that questionnaire and then you do this next step and review the documents thoroughly. There's a lot of times where I've seen it on both sides where we send over tons of information or we get tons of information and it's not read. That SOC report's over 100 pages. Did you go through every single page to answer what that third-party assessment looked like and answered? Oh yeah, you did. I know you did. Yeah. But unfortunately, not everyone's you, right? So, again, conduct an interview. A lot of questions could be answered in a way that are somewhat ambiguous, and from a service provider perspective, because not all are transparent, they answer a question like what we saw before that sounds very pretty, but is it actually true? Conduct a site visit based on your risks. So if you come out with a risk rating and you say that all your service providers that are high deserve a site visit because they're working with very confidential information or they're working on critical functions to your business, you should absolutely go out and perform a site visit. You should make the expectation with your business, negotiate that with your business to say, I'm going to go out there for any vendor that you have as high risk. We have to go visit them every time we do an assessment or at certain checkpoints. Next is something that was missing in the previous process. Work with your legal team to have contract amendments. When I was with an FI, I partnered very closely with legal so that after we completed assessments, legal could not move forward with an agreement until after they've heard from me. And they would come back and say, okay, standard language or do you need more stuff? And I would say, oh yeah, we need more stuff. And and they would actually put it into the contract. And that's the only way you can make sure that all this work that you're doing is actually fruitful. In a lot of terms, if you have major issues, they should be in the contract as amendments on issues that either one, will be addressed, or two, have been noted in the agreement as deficiencies. Establish regular checkpoints, especially if you have significant or high-risk issues. Make it a point to say, okay, Mr. Service Provider, I'm going to be back in 3 months for a progress report on your lack of DLP or the fact that you don't have IDS in this environment because you told me that you're looking at vendors now. Establish a 3-month checkpoint. Have regular check-ins. Again, it holds the service provider because just like us, we want our information security program to be as best as possible. So does that service provider. And that means that if they feel some client pressure, the executives are not going to say, oh yeah, Acme Corp was really hot on it for a month ago, but we haven't heard from them in 7 months, and we need to move the money somewhere else, right? So establish regular checkpoints, especially if you have issues that need to be worked on and identified. Establish an expectation of reassessment. Not only the expectation, but actually do reassessments. That means that if you have a high, medium, or low vendor, that highs you may reassess every year, or mediums every 2 years, or lows every 5 years. Whatever that frequency is, understand what it is, communicate that out to your business, communicate it out to the service providers so they could plan appropriately. Some of these assessments, especially for larger financial institutions, you're sending over 500 questions. That's an investment in resources both for the service provider, right? So set that expectation that, hey, every 2 years, I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you to do this. And you need to plan appropriately. And really, that's how you get to that mission accomplished possibility. It's being able to have a process in place that's reasonable, that's repetitive, and that's ongoing. So the last thing I want to talk about is, one of the last things I want to talk about is service organizations controls, or SOC, and their dirty little secrets. Because I've been in organizations that say, oh, well, they have a SOC, right? So they're good. No, that's not true. A SOC is not a substitute for an assessment. It simply isn't. A SOC is a good starting point. It shows that the company has invested in security, but it's not the end-all and be-all of everything. Understand that SOCs are more than just one. When I say SOC, there's a difference between who could tell me what the difference between a SOC 1 and SOC 2 is? No? Anyone? I'll give you a free t-shirt. What? 2. 1 and 2. I love this crowd. SOC 1 addresses your financial controls. SOC 2 addresses your general controls, right? And there's a difference between type 1 and type 2. Type 1 only looks at the design of the control. That means that, you know, a Big Four or another consultancy company came in and said, yeah, these documents look pretty good, as opposed to a type 2 where they not only read the documents, but did some kind of testing and sample set of those controls. Lastly, on the SOC, understand the scope of the SOC. Scope is very important. I've been assessing third parties or third-party service providers, and I have started looking and understanding and reading the document that really I knew they were just trying to pull one over me. So understand the scope. Understand what's going on there. I want to end with some conclusions. Again, I really feel like these third-party assessments, because they're so new in so many different organizations, they're really seen as internal audit. We got to do it. We got to get it done. Let's just do it and get it over with. When they could really be leveraged to improve your information security program holistically, especially if you're a service provider, and from a client side, especially because you need to assess that risk at third parties. On the client side, the process needs to be risk-based and holistic, and also reasonable. It's not reasonable to just send out this questionnaire and I want this returned tomorrow and it's 500 questions. I don't care. You're my service provider. No, that's not reasonable. You want to establish a clear partnership. You want to make sure you address the controls holistically. As a service provider, make sure you run a transparent response program that's as part of overall your risk management program. As a service provider, what you should be doing is saying, I service these industries. This is what these industries are looking at. This is how I need to improve my program. And you need to be transparent about the controls that you have and do not have. There's a few folks I'd like to say thank you. My wife and my family. Cool Acid. Mr. Ben 10 over there. Hi, Ben. Thank you. Elizabeth Martin, Road Clown, Fubar, all the folks from BSides and MySec, you guys are fantastic and encourage me to do better all the time. So thank you guys. This is my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm really hoping that this talk will get accepted somewhere else and I could blow it out to maybe an hour and really dig into some of the issues around those questionnaires, understanding what's going on with why these things are doing. Look at issues like workforce and things that I feel like are really contributing to this problem. But if you'd like to talk to me about this issue or anything else, especially Kale, I would love to talk about that. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for voting for my talk. Thanks, BSides Chicago.